by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013 before joining the academia. She spent many years as an editor with BBC Monitoring, a division of BBC World Service. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Linda Quayle.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I hope this is never a good slot straight after lunch, so I hope I'm not going to send you to sleep. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers enormously for this conference. I'm very privileged to be here, and a special thanks to Dr. Nassif and Dr. Harvey and Dr. Francis for all their organisation, which I really appreciate. Which way do I press? Oh, there we go. My presentation has 3 sections, a rather long introduction, for which I apologize in advance, a snapshot of the case studies, time doesn't permit us going into those in too much depth, and the main argument, which is about the role of Southeast Asia's US allies in negotiating or renegotiating a regional order transition. So, first the introduction. This presentation is part of a larger collaboration, first of all, called Hegemony and Great Power Management, initiated and led by Dr. Matteo Dian and Hugo Meja. And I also want to stress that this is a work in progress, so I would really value your feedback. The hypothesis of the project as a whole is this: the rise of China and its selective contestation of the material and normative pillars of the US-led liberal order in East Asia has generated a process of renegotiation of American hegemony and of great power management among regional powers, primary institutions. This has resulted in the consolidation and diversification of the network of alliances and defense partnerships in the region, i.e. secondary institutions. And my role is to work out how the Philippines and Thailand not getting the... Oh, no, back. Oh, there we go. Right. Okay. First little hiccup. Right, so my role in this is to work out how the Philippines and Thailand, as US allies in Southeast Asia, fit into this picture. Now, this is a little indigestible as it stands, so I'm going to unpack it in 2 different ways. If I can get my... Yeah, there we go. First of all, the regional processes being described here are selective contestation, renegotiation, consolidation, and diversification. Notice it is selective contestation. China, in many ways, has fitted in surprisingly well with the US-led order established after the Second World War. But as its power grows, there increasingly appear to be elements that China is... This has gone back. Weird. That's where we were, right? Okay, sorry, I'm going to have a bit of technical issues here. As its power... As its power grows, there increasingly appear to be elements that China is pushing against. I'll just carry on. We can catch up with the PowerPoint later. Highly important for Southeast Asia is the nexus of norms connected with the South China Sea. And you're all really familiar with that issue, especially living here in the Philippines. Perhaps even more foundational, though, is the attempt to challenge the current hierarchy. And I'll come back to that later, because that's a key point. But what that means for Southeast Asia. But expectations that China would always be content to play second fiddle in an order it was not instrumental in creating were probably always a little bit optimistic. That's the one, yeah. Is it good? Oh. Okay. You might have to extend your arm. Yeah, my students would tell you, yeah, she's a technology killer, and here I am doing this. I have a reputation. So challenging the hierarchy. And yeah, we're still not clear on exactly what kind of order China is likely to champion. We don't know yet. But it's putting forward conceptual alternatives in various areas, including global economy, development, as we heard from Professor He this morning, and human rights. And we're still working out how much traction these are gaining. Oh, yes, definitely. According to the hypothesis we saw, this process of selective contestation is linked to changes in the region's defense networks. And there's little doubt that we've generally been witnessing a transition from the traditional hub and spokes of the US alliance system to a security architecture that demonstrates much more networking. And this can be seen in a number of ways, in increased spoke-to-spoke activity. So the US is the hub and the different allies are the spokes, and now they're relating to each other. Increased cooperation with non-allied partners, and a growing number of multilateral endeavors, many under the auspices of ASEAN. There's plenty of evidence, some of which I will come to later, that the Philippines and Thailand are extensively involved in this kind of activity as well. But what is interesting here is the mode of renegotiation. Southeast Asia states, as is well known, have not unambiguously come together to try to apply a brake on China's rise. Indeed, many of the changes observed in the right-hand column here are themselves a little double-sided, right? Are these activities a case of responding to China's rise, and as a reverse of that coin, responding to doubts about the intentions and the long-term capability of the US? Or are they also a logical response to transnational problems that require coordinated solutions? Or is one a useful cloak for the other? Now, Yeah, so we have a doubt expressed there. Now, the hypothesis revolves around three English school concepts. Sorry, I'm struggling with my PowerPoint here a bit. Yes, that's regional processes. So Thailand and Philippines, as we say, have not followed a straightforward path. You know, they're doing different things. And observers have frequently, this is not new at all. Observers have frequently noticed this, and they've talked about it as hedging, for which Professor Quick gives a very opposite definition. But hedging doesn't really capture the stake that different players have in negotiating and influencing the region's order transition. Hedging has got a more of a negative feel to it, right? And we've had people talk about omnibalancing as well. And that doesn't really quite cut it either. It doesn't really explain what's going on. Now that the two heavyweights in the Asia-Pacific are so disproportionately prominent, it's not really equi or omni. It's these two, isn't it? It's China and the US. And this is where it's useful to turn to English school understandings, I think. So let me just look at the hypothesis again. Yep. Oh, no. It revolves around these concepts: hegemony, great power management, and institutions, both primary and secondary. And I'm going to briefly sketch a little bit of background to the English school, which I said yesterday must be the worst named body of international relations theory on the entire planet, and a real menace when you're doing database searches. It is not necessarily that well known, so I will just very briefly sketch what it is about and what it focuses on. Oh, no. It goes back. That's right, okay. So it focuses international society, and Barry Buzan sums it up really simply: just as human beings, as individuals, live in societies which they both shape and are shaped by, so also states live in an international society which they shape and are shaped by. Now, let us not fall into the trap of seeing this arrangement as some kind of idealism, as even quite noted theorists like Mearsheimer have mischaracterized it. We all have experience of societies, we know what societies are, and we recognize their advantages. It's good to be part of society. But we all know as well that societies are not necessarily bright and sunny places. So the English school uses the word institutions as in the sense of underlying sets of habits and practices shaped towards the realization of common goals. And these change to reflect notions of legitimacy at any given time. And examples of these institutions are sovereignty, diplomacy, and great power management. I'll come back to that one in a minute because that's so important for our discussion. We can also differentiate between primary or foundational institutions and secondary institutions, which represent the way any given primary institution expresses itself at any given time in any given space. And in our case, we're particularly interested in the institution of great power management. This expresses the idea that great powers are not purely the bullies in the school playground, although they can be that, let's be honest, but have special responsibilities within international society. And we regularly come across this idea, don't we? Whenever the US or the UN Security Council is called on to do something about a pressing problem, then what we're expressing is really this idea. Now, alliances and defense mechanisms are the secondary manifestations of great power management. The US-led alliances were set up after the Second World War in order to defend the order that the US had put in place. What about hegemony then? How does the English school see that? Well, Ian Clark is a scholar who has done a lot of work on this, and he argues that hegemony is one expression of great power management and is an institutionalized practice of special rights and responsibilities conferred, that's the important word, by international society or a constituency within it on a state or states with the resources to lead. Now, this is not just a synonym for primacy or preponderance, which I think in the context of our discussions about China and Southeast Asia is really important and really useful. Primacy and preponderance, they tend to relate solely to material factors. So this is an important distinction to make. Notice it says conferred. In this understanding, you can't just decide to be the hegemon. That has to be conferred on you, that status, by states around you. And hegemony is grounded then in legitimacy, according to Clark, and therefore constantly subject to negotiation or renegotiation. It's not a case of you have it and therefore you've always got it. Evelyn Goh, in similar vein, argues that hegemony is unequal power backed by a greater portion of consent than coercion. Now, talking of Evelyn Goh, she has developed an argument over many years now, a Singaporean scholar who has worked in many different parts of the world, that in the post-Cold War period in East Asia, the United States emerged as the regional hegemon, understood in the terms that we've just described. That is, it became the hegemon not just because it had the biggest military and the biggest economy, but because it had some degree of hegemonic legitimacy. And she conceives of a layered hierarchy with the US at the top, China as the biggest player in the second rung, along with Japan, and South Korea and ASEAN positioned in the third tier. Now, 2 quick points here. Firstly, this is de facto rather than de jure. East Asia's governments do not go round overtly acknowledging the hegemonic presence of the US. Equality is what we always insist on in our speech, isn't it? Hierarchy, however, is what we act out often in our behavior in the international society. Secondly, we don't have to like the United States to acknowledge its hegemony. You know, there's always been a lot of grumbling about it, clearly. Now, not necessarily a problem in the Philippines, of course. In the Philippines, people generally do like the US. That's the top line of these figures, which go back many, many years now. Although I'd be very interested to hear if that looks any different from Mindanao, if the perspective here is any different to that. So very clear, you know, liking here. But in Thailand, there's a lot more ambiguity. This is opinion of China, and, you know, you can hardly separate them, 72 and 73. I can't remember which one was which. So the hegemonic legitimacy of the US, and remember this is always open to contestation, consists in, as Go suggests, its role as the regional security guarantor from an offshore position that limits its territorial ambitions and makes it look less threatening, and also in its leadership of a regional order that includes the rule of law and an open economic system, both of which are understood rather generally. You know, when we get into the details and the nitty-gritty, there are often differences of opinion, as we'll come on to later. Now, just by looking at the diagram, it's really clear what the current renegotiation is all about, right? Does the US have sufficient legitimacy to carry on in the top spot in East Asia? Does it really want to? Clearly, China will not be happy with a perpetual second ranking, yet it doesn't yet, at least, command sufficient legitimacy of its own to wholly replace the US as hegemon in that legitimated sense that we talked about before. Will it be able to gain that legitimacy? On what basis will that happen? Will the US be able to negotiate a collective hegemony? How will Japan see that? If that were to happen, could ASEAN avoid relegation to some, fourth layer of the hierarchy? Now, it's in the context of dynamically attempting to negotiate and influence the outcomes of the questions like these that I think the Allies' behavior should be understood. Stuck again. It's funny, isn't it? I get the knack and then I lose it all over again. There we go. Interesting times. There's a Chinese cartoon. Now there's one extra thing of English school terminology that I would like to introduce. I'm nearly done with this, honestly. This is the idea that there are different types of international society. Pluralist societies are thinner and less ambitious in terms of what can be achieved. And they stress qualities like autonomy, diversity, consensus. Solidarist societies are thicker and more ambitious in their goals because they are based on, or should be based on, thicker levels of solidarity. And they therefore seek wider-ranging, more ambitious cooperation and are more open to enforcement mechanisms. And at examples, it's easy to see that ASEAN and the EU, even the EU in somewhat crisis mode, are good examples of the two types. And the liberal core of global international society, especially in the post-Cold War period, is also solidarist. It's attempting to be thicker, whereas the global international society as a whole tends to be a thinner thing. This is an aside based on what Professor He said this morning, which I think is worth coming back to it. Up to now, solidarist societies have always been based on a kind of liberal idea, a deeper, thicker, a liberal-based idea. But the solidarist societies don't have to be solid behind that particular idea. They can become solid behind another idea, and he very interestingly suggested the idea of development. Now, this is going to be useful. Honestly, I'm not dragging you through this just for the sake of it. It's going to be useful when we look at the alliance partnerships in a minute. So, my aim then is to respond to the hypothesis, here it is again, by positioning the US allies' behavior in the context of US hegemonic legitimacy. Right, now I apologize again, that was a long introduction, but if I didn't do that, the terms of the whole exercise wouldn't really make sense. So I hope it makes a little bit more sense. So let's come on to the case studies. Again, this is going to be quite brief. So we're looking at the Philippines and Thailand, and I'll just show you a piece. This is a piece that appeared a couple of years ago. What's wrong with the United States Southeast Asia allies, it asks. The Philippines and Thailand are not acting like US treaty allies are supposed to. Now, the title is actually a very clever piece of clickbait, in fact, because the author concludes by arguing it is no more likely that Thailand and the Philippines will want to be entirely beholden to China than they wish to be entirely beholden to the United States. Nevertheless, the headline point remains that the Philippines and Thailand have demonstrated unusual alliance patterns. There we go. Very briefly, because a lot of you will be very familiar with this material, in the Philippines we've seen markedly different positions from three different presidents. President Arroyo with a kind of, equibalancing type of idea. President Aquino, much closer to the US and more conflictual towards China. And President Duterte steering much further back towards China, but of course not entirely abandoning the US at all. There are many reasons for this beyond the systemic level that I'm talking about. In the post-Cold War period, for example, we've seen constant adjustments as the internal and external security issues in the Philippines, the question of Islamic insurgency, for example, intersect with the changing interests and priorities of the US. So that's been one thing that has caused changes. We've also witnessed a number of examples of triangular diplomacy, where the US ally and where the US and China are kind of played off against one another in the interests of obtaining more benefits. So that can be another reason for this backwards and forwards. From a domestic point of view, in the Philippines, I was just speaking to an expert just at lunchtime, this is a highly personalized system, as you know. And there are constitutional parameters in the Philippines too. The current president is stressing the principle of an independent foreign policy, but that's mandated in the constitution, in fact. In Thailand, headlines have been particularly captured by the acrimony since the 2014 coup, when the Obama administration very explicitly and publicly condemned the military takeover. But links with China have been going back, since the 1970s, and of course historically links with China go back centuries. There's currently a debate as to whether Thailand has already moved into China's orbit, or whether the relationship is now back on track with President Trump's more pragmatic approach, or whether, as I personally think is more likely, that this whole dance is just part and parcel of Thailand's trademark power mitigating strategy. Yeah, I need finger exercises here. Yeah, there we go. What then about the network security architecture that formed the trigger for this project? Both countries are, first of all, fully involved in ASEAN-sponsored initiatives. These include forums for consultation, all of those different forums that exist within ASEAN now. They include practical exercises. They usually involve fairly safe, humanitarian, non-aggressive rubrics, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And some of these have specifically included China. But they are potentially a part of the scene, partly because there's a certain amount of competition involved as states do this, and partly because this type of activity is a part of ASEAN's continued attempt at great power enmeshment. So it's not possible to entirely divorce these activities from the great power scene. Both countries are involved also in significant minilaterals in response to specific security needs. Here we've got Thailand involved in the Malacca Straits Patrol, Eyes in the Sky, and Philippines in the trilateral cooperative arrangement now with Indonesia and Malaysia. But more pointedly, increased networking is particularly apparent in the profile of major joint exercises. And key among these is Balikatan in the Philippines and Cobra Gold in Thailand. Both have been subject to political input. The Philippines scaled down and refocused the exercise last year, for example, as part of President Duterte's defense recalibration. And the US initially scaled down its troop contribution in reaction to Thailand's coup. But significantly, both have continued. And both demonstrate, and again this is very important, continued multilateralization. Balikatan in 2017, for example, involved the US, the Philippines, Japan, and Australia, so that this is developed from a purely bilateral exercise. Cobra Gold in 2018 this year directly involved the US, Thailand, Singapore, South Korea, Indonesia, Japan, and Malaysia, plus many more observer states. It's kind of quite a circus now. And I will spare you. Every year you get the Marines drinking the snake blood thing. You know, honestly, every year. I checked back, it goes back to 2012, but every year it's still big news. You know? US official reports, I mean, going back to even 2008, indicate that copper gold was seen as important in supporting the goal of increased regional cooperation, providing an arena for the Japanese military, for example, to play a bigger role, and allowing the US to engage with the Indonesian military, again as an example. For Thailand as well, the multilateralization trend is also apparent in Cope Tiger. Don't you love these exercise names? This is a Thailand-US-Singapore aerial exercise. And originally, this one, Cooperation and Readiness Afloat, or CARAT, was a series of bilateral exercises, but it expanded to a trilateral in 2017, again involving Thailand, the US, and Singapore. Both countries take part in the US-led CCAT, Southeast Asia Cooperation and Training, and the biennial RIMPAC, that's the rim of the Pacific exercise. And in the Philippines, Kamandag, it's really acronym city this, isn't it? The 2007 replacement for the cancelled bilateral FIBLEX also involved Japanese self-defense force personnel in a civic assistance role. And, you know, there are many more. I'm going through very quickly. Japan and Australia are the focal points of many other drills. In all, then, the Philippines and Thailand are involved in a fair amount of networking behavior. Now, just a caveat here. We can move on. We shouldn't read too much. You know, let's not, read too much into all of this. Most of the time, these exercises are not specifically pointed in one direction, i.e. anti-China. Definitely not. China, for example, has observed copper gold and participated in RIMPAC. Thailand has also taken part in exercises with China since 2007, albeit much smaller ones. And spoke-to-spoke activity has domestic as well as geopolitical motivations. It can be a way, if your military budget is not huge, it can be a way of eking it out a little bit. Or it can be a way of satisfying the military, who need a few bones for whatever reason. Yet, having said that, having given the caveat, yet China does clearly see them alongside close reconnaissance and intelligence collection and the Freedom of Navigation program as part of the build-up of US military activities that followed Obama's rebalancing strategy. So there's a kind of balance to be maintained about the significance of these. Now, I don't have time to go into detail all of this this afternoon. I haven't finished the research on this part anyway. But diplomatic relations and patterns of military acquisition and aid also fit in here. It's the question of you get things from different sources. Rather than just relying on your ally, the US, to supply you with military equipment or whatever, you are sourcing military equipment and semi-military equipment from a variety of sources. That also increases the network idea. So what does all this mean? What role are the Southeast Asian allies playing in renegotiating our regional order transition? So let's come back briefly to the diagram that we started with, which you can fill in a little bit more of now. We've seen that Philippine and Thai behavior bears out the project leader's hypothesis, but not in any straightforward manner. All the elements of networking are there, we've just seen them, but they are mitigated, they're periodically heated up and cooled down, and they're retooled and adjusted. I want to consider two elements of the renegotiation that I think might be going on. The first is hierarchy. The enhanced networking indicates, I think, a desire to affirm relations with the US and to keep it in the top drawer of the hierarchy. Neither ally, neither Thailand nor the Philippines, wants to lose the US overlay anytime soon, or wants China in the top spot right at the moment. But both, I think, and this is very important, are indicating the need, in their different ways, are indicating the need to work with the grain of China's requirement for special status rather than against it. And the ambiguity, I hope, encourages the US to see China through its allies' eyes in a way that wouldn't be possible if Thailand and the Philippines were wholly predictable yes-men type of allies. Back in January 2010, for example, a US official records finding Thai views on China surprising, in that there was a universal lack of concern over whether China's rise could potentially disrupt regional security. But this official then goes on to say, the Thai officials continue to encourage the US to participate in the ministers' gathering ADMM+, a grouping that could otherwise be dominated by China. So, there's this two-way thing. A recent, very fascinating study of attitudes among mainly military Thai officials reveals contradictions that can also be explained within this hierarchical model. There we go. Right, this is a study that came out of an Australian study. And again, these are mostly military officials in Thailand, remember, and very recent. These officials fully expected US influence to decline. So I'm going to show you 4 slides which look on the face of it completely contradictory, but actually if you put them in that hierarchical kind of framework, they make some sense. So they expect US influence to decline. They're concerned about China's growing military power. Very concerned is the top half up there, so there's a lot of 8s. Yet, when asked about perceptions of threats from the great powers, look who they see as the most threatening. Interesting, right? They see the US as the most threatening, their ally. They were positive about China's Thailand's reliance on China for protection against military threats. So again, not at all reliant, very reliant. They were up there in saying, yes, we have a reliance on China. But they also were very positive about reliance on the United States for security as well. As one put it, we don't want the Chinese to do what they want. That's why we appreciate the US coming into the region to be another big guy on the block. So on the face of it, it looks really contradictory, right? But if you think of it in the sense of, we want the US up there in the top drawer for the time being, but we also want to see a way of China being able to, express its influence as well. Now, in the Philippines, this is... there we go. In the Philippines, this is a poll taken last year. Strong support for a continued US military presence. Interestingly enough, at the exact same time as this strong support for a president who has stamped down ties with the US, So again, you get this little contradictory behavior. And last year's polls also indicated increased support for strong economic relations with China at the expense of being tough on territorial disputes. This is quite striking, I think, after so many years of heightened tension between the Philippines and China. And of course, there's any number of things that China could do that could erode this sentiment at any point. Nevertheless, I think that there is a room for all, but in the right order syndrome that is still apparent even in the Philippines. And ultimately, I've already suggested that China doesn't currently have the legitimacy to be the hegemon, but an optimum scenario for US allies, I think, would be to see China continuing to rise within a modified form of the US-sanctioned second layer of the hierarchy until such times... Here we go. It's me, I killed it. Until such times as it has gained its own mantle of legitimacy, which of course is unlikely to be on the same basis as the current hegemonial arrangement. I don't think we're likely to see just a reworking of what we have. Compromises are going to be necessary for sure, and again building on what Professor He said this morning. And can at least, potentially share in some collective hegemony in the future. Now, maybe this won't be possible. Maybe this will turn out to be just too hard, and maybe we will end up in the conflict for primacy that the realists are always predicting is going to happen. But it need not be so. And Southeast Asia's allies, I think, are doing their best in their different ways to show that they're reluctant to make it impossible, put it that way. It may not be possible, but they are reluctant to make it impossible. And they're doing this in different ways. Thailand by sticking to the middle of the stream in the way it's often done, and the Philippines by tacking, you know, over here, correct, but not a straightforward movement. This shows a reluctance, I think, to make it impossible that this hierarchical framework can evolve in peaceful ways. As far as they're concerned, a layered disposition of power also includes China. It doesn't isolate it. Ongoing US legitimacy as the regional hegemon, therefore, depends on maintaining the hierarchy. So that means the US being present, taking care of its allies, keeping its own house in order, and not prioritizing its own rivalry with China over order in the region at large, at risk of antagonizing China, marginalizing ASEAN, and or introducing a new Cold War or, God forbid, hot war into the region, until such times as it can be revised in a way that's acceptable to all, including China, perhaps as part of a collective hegemony. And what about China then? Well, it rightly feels it deserves more say for its historic reasons and for the point of view of the amount of population it has and its growth. It's admired, but it's not yet trusted. And it's not yet clear about the future order that it wants, which is problematic. And historical circumstances are such that the South China Sea is a clear Achilles heel for China's quest for legitimacy. This is an area where China is likely to keep losing legitimacy, yet feels strategically unable to countenance a change of policy. So any consensual rejigging of the hierarchy we're not going to end up with something that's optimal. It's going to be more a case of what can we all live with, which again picks up on what Professor He was saying this morning. It's a pragmatic response here. Now, just to finish off, and I'm nearly done, the second element of the renegotiation has to do with the quality of international society within the hierarchy, the thickness, as we said, of societal cooperation. Because alliance relationships have a societal dimension too. Thailand and the Philippines have sometimes been at the vortex of questions about what type of society is feasible. And there are a couple of headlines which illustrate exactly those questions. There we go. Now, it's very important not to create binaries here. You know, it's really important not to sort of say, oh yes, solidarist US versus pluralist Southeast Asia. It's really not as simple as that. Thailand, for example, was highly solidarist in its democracy and human rights agenda at the end of the 1990s, before the advent of Thaksin and the coup cycle. And the Philippines, similarly, has a vocal rights-defending civil society, and human rights are given a really prominent place in the constitution. The end of the Cold War saw solidarist goals being privileged, with the US placing huge emphasis, as we talked about this morning, on human rights and democracy promotion. But, you know, it's never hard to find pluralist characteristics beneath the solidarist rhetoric. And under Trump, under President Trump, of course, the picture is also mixed. The president has little interest in human rights, but other strands of the US government do, and shared values form part of the rallying call in the national security strategy that came out recently. So with these caveats duly noted, it's not black and white. However, I think it is possible to discern a broad pluralist-solidarist split that has in part conditioned US relations with its allies in Southeast Asia. The US has tended to envisage alliances in solidarist rather than pluralist terms, with an emphasis on shared values rather than just shared interests, and a recourse to coercion and conditionality to make sure that they are upheld, which has been a source of huge frustration in both the Thai military and the Philippines military from time to time. Now, most of the time, this difference is smoothed over. You know, you do the diplomatic thing, you move on. Nevertheless, it can have the effect of making China seem easier to live with than the US. Again, this goes back to what was said this morning. In Thailand, the idea that the US is a threat, remember we saw that in the graph just a few slides ago, stems partly from perceptions that the United States interferes in Thailand's domestic politics. Now, again, these disparities are not generally deal breakers. Successive governments work around them, sometimes grumblingly. And under Trump, pragmatic Cold War mores may also prevail, as they did when the United States tolerated dictatorships in Thailand and in the Philippines. But, you know, it's not easy picking a road here as a solidarist thrust, because the US lost legitimacy, of course, among publics in those countries then, and stands to do so again if it wholly embraces a realpolitik type stance. So the optimum is to match the desired solidarism with the available levels of homegrown solidarity, which may wax and wane, as we've seen in both Philippines and Thailand. Now, I've focused on human rights and democracy as the most dramatic and headline-hitting issues for the Philippines and Thailand, and also in the interest of time. But in the areas of trade and international law, we also see these pluralist, solidarist fault lines between the US approach and the East Asian approach. China, avowedly pluralist, like again we saw this morning, easily makes hay in these sorts of interstices. So the second argument the paper is making is about societal quality. Pushing solidarism beyond its actual underpinnings of solidarity invites pushback of different kinds in ways that can make alliance building more difficult. Now, I would argue that this is by far the less important of the two things I've discussed. It's less important than this previous axis of renegotiation of hierarchy that I was talking about. But the US probably would think the priority is the other way round. Okay, so putting all this together, this is, let's add the hypothesis just to conclude. I would argue in response then to the original hypothesis, the rise of China and its selective contestation of the material and normative pillars of the US-led liberal order in East Asia has generated a process of renegotiation, like we saw. I would add to that the behavior of the Southeast Asian allies suggests that US hegemonic legitimacy diminishes to the extent that the hierarchical arrangement is undermined, either by US opt-out or refusal to countenance a modified role for China, and to the extent that the US pushes solidarist goals beyond the solidarity available to support them. This has resulted in the consolidation and diversification of the networks, as we saw earlier, and I would add that in the case of Thailand and the Philippines, this reconfiguration is non-linear and involves considerable disruption. Therefore, taking account of these disruptive factors, however, can benefit the US position in the long run. Oh, now we've gone off again. There we go, back. So thank you very much, especially for your patience with my slide issue. Thank you, and I'll look forward to your questions. Okay.
Now I will entertain a question or two in the interest of time. Please raise your hand and just proceed to the microphones in front.
Good afternoon. My name is Lara Baarde. I'm a student here, IS student from Ateneo de Davao. I'd just like to sort of ask your opinion, since you're talking about the concept of hegemony. I'll go a little constructivist on it, but we've discussed before how hegemony seems to be a sort of a Western constructive ideal. And since we're talking about the idea of China the idea of China contesting that position as a hegemon, because it's been discussed by China many times before that their aim is not to be a hegemon, So in your opinion, what do you think about the idea that China isn't necessarily trying to sort of impinge on this whole structure, this hierarchy, because they don't believe in it? What if they're just trying to restructure this way that we see great powers, great states? Are they trying to put themselves are they trying to challenge the US in the sense that they're trying to become the best or the greatest before them? Or are they just trying to create their own legitimacy? Since you discussed that there is this legitimacy in order to be a great power, and you have to be recognized by the international society. But do you think that maybe China doesn't agree with this legitimacy, or they have their own way of legitimizing themselves, especially since they're creating this huge influence, not only just among Asian states, but also now that they're going forward to the West? And
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay, this is working. I think Clark's idea of hegemony is interesting because it bypasses some of the problems with the notion of being a kind of Western-oriented sort of thing. So I guess in a sense, you can't just want to be a hegemon. You can't, wake up in the morning and say, I want to be, or I don't want to be a hegemon. It depends on what the international society around you, the legitimacy that they are recording you. So I guess that's the one point. That's the first point. Now, does China not want to be a hegemon? Of course, it says it doesn't. And I think China is commendable in a way for the degree to which it has fitted in with an order that it didn't actually make, or wasn't particularly instrumental in creating. And of course, it did that partly because it values order in itself, and partly because it was good for its own economic growth. It was good to have an orderly world, and so China, definitely was able to sort of make the most of that order in order to grow. And that, to me, is a good thing that it's done that. I think and China has talked about, again, as Professor He mentioned this morning, has talked about China wanting to have a new pattern for great power relations with America, and I think that's important and needs to be listened to. I think what's happened in China recently, especially over the last year or so, shows a very definite attempt to emerge from the period when we're biding our time and we're just making the most of the order that we've got, into an era where they definitely feel that they have, they deserve to be more on the world stage. And I can't argue with that. They do deserve to be more on the world stage. And their struggles sometimes to be part of the global institutions and to have the part that they feel they want to play, the frustration with, this is not working. This is partly why they have put forward different institutions like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, things like this. Not that these are wildly revolutionary. I mean, they're really not. And then last year, the end of last year, we saw the Communist Party Congress, and we saw a much more kind of overt push by China to say, this is China's awakening, China's renaissance. We are here, and we are a force to be reckoned with. So I think China is definitely striving to put itself in a position that is higher up. I would not necessarily say that China wants to be the top rank and displace everyone else. I don't think that's necessarily true. But I think China wants a path upwards, and I think the US has to come to terms with that. There has to be a renegotiation of how this works, because just trying to keep China down is not going to be possible. Now, there was another element of your question, because it was a very good and detailed question. Oh yeah, creating your own legitimacy. Yeah, I think we have to be open to how China is going to do that. And again, this goes back to Professor He's presentation this morning, and he was talking about the things China does. China is very interested in being perceived as a legitimate power, for sure. There's a lot of literature which kind of, I'm not a reader of Chinese, but there's a lot of literature from Chinese scholars which makes this very clear. So China does want to preserve its legitimacy, which is why the problem in the South China Sea is a really, really difficult one, because from everyone else's eyes, it loses legitimacy there. But we do have to be open to the fact that its legitimacy is going to be based on something different from the order that the US championed. And there are going to be compromises there, I think.
Okay.
So,
in the interest of time, Linda, I think that's the only question we can entertain.
I'm sorry for the long answer in that
Anyway,
case.
you're still here until even Sunday, so you can just approach Linda and talk to her. Thank you very much. A round of applause for Linda Quayle from the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Thank you very much, Linda. Our next Bulawan speaker is Dr. Titus C. Chen, Associate Professor of Political Science and the Deputy Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the National Sun Yat-sen University, Kaohsiung, Taiwan. He earned his doctoral degree of political science from the University of California, Irvine in 2008. His works have appeared in Asian Perspective, International Spectator, Journal of Contemporary China, Issues and Studies, Taiwanese Journal of Political Science, and Journal of Social Sciences and Philosophy. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Dr. Titus C. Chen.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank PHISO for inviting me from an island to this island, where island peoples are making connection and making waves. Today, I'm glad to be in this speaking series. Our previous speaker emphasized the power of China, the influence of China in the region, and I'm going to follow up on that subject mainly, but not necessarily in this region, but also in global institutions, particularly in global human rights institutions. China was a latecomer in UN human rights institutions, including Commission or any other such as refugee agency. In 1979, China became the observer state in UN Human Rights Commission because of the Vietnamese engagement, military conflicts with Cambodia. And Cambodia back then was China's ally. So in order to help give a moral and a symbolic support for the regime in Cambodia, China filed for observer status in UN Human Rights Commission. In 1982, after a few years of practice or apprenticeship, China became she earned the full UN HRC membership. In 1986, China helped UN General Assembly to adopt this resolution on the right to development, even though that is not a binding or a legally binding document. It set a milestone for China's participation in world forum or public opinion on human rights. In 1988, that was a high time of China's reform and opening up policy, when liberalism or liberal thought and values ran high within the inner circles of Chinese politics. In 1988 was the 40th anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And China, for the very first time since the establishment of PRC, officially celebrated UDHR. That was a milestone for China and the human rights scholars in China. And then, less than a year later, in June 1989, Tiananmen Massacre happened. This democracy movement that began as an anti-corruption campaign among people, especially college students, ended up with bloodshed. Oops. It's testing my fingers facility. Huh? In 1991, and following 89 massacre, China was isolated and sanctioned by international community. Major Western powers, including Japan, withdrew their investment and named and shamed China in human rights institutions, followed by numerous NGO critical reports on China's human rights condition. Beijing was forced to respond by issuing her first human rights white paper in 1991. In that paper, Beijing highlighted her support, her endorsement for the right to subsistence and the right to development. Now, it sounds innocuous and innocent, and it is a Marxist and a materialist understanding of rights. In 1994, at a World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, they passed the Vienna Declaration, balancing this polarizing issue of universality and particularity. They used language to try to strike a balance between these two poles. Because of that conference, UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights was established. So actually, High Commissioner's Office in UN for Human Rights was a recent development, a recent invention. Throughout the 1990s, we witnessed a resistance and a pushback on the Chinese side against Western normative pressure. In particular, China had resisted the country-specific mandates in UN Human Rights Commission, this what they call the naming and shaming strategy by Western powers. Sometimes China won the argument, sometimes China lost, but most of the time, because of her allies in the developing world, China won the argument. China won the debate and the voting. Eventually, 1998 to 1999 was a watershed period when China openly, her president Jiang Zemin openly acknowledged the universality of human rights, meaning human rights norms as honored and acknowledged in UDHR shall be applied in China. And the Western pressure went away because of China declared to open her market and expressed willingness to learn from the West. And at that time, in late 1990s, the US government was willing to engage China, to change China through engagement, and allow China to enter into World Trade Organization. All the indicators telling you that there seems to be a ceasefire on the matter of human rights between Western powers and China. In 2004, the Chinese, the ruling Communist Party of China, amended its national constitution, writing the state protects and respects human rights into the preamble of PRC constitution. In 2007, the party charter was amended by an addition of human rights protection clause into this charter. So that was normative milestones for China's human rights policy. I'm pulling between the... Ooh. During 2004 to 2006, United Nations went through a structural reform under the leadership of Kofi Annan, the Secretary General. China was at first very suspicious of this restructuring move, but later on, Beijing realized they can turn this for their own advantage. Within this structural reform campaign, Secretary General Kofi Annan wanted to have an overhaul on Human Rights Commission because it has been politicized, discredited, and it is not efficient. It did not really carry forward and promote human rights across the world. So Human Rights Commission was reformed into an uplifted and upgraded Human Rights Council. Still, it is below, as far as administrative ranking is concerned, it's below Security Council. But compared to Human Rights Commission, now Human Rights Council, as of now, is on a par with Economic and Social Council. China was a big promoter of Human Rights Council, this reform agenda. China was very influential in the design of Human Rights Council. And China pushed for this non-binding and voluntarist nature of universal periodic review. You know, now every 4 years, every country has to be, its human rights conditions have to be reviewed by UN Human Rights Council. But it is voluntary, meaning any country is entitled to rejecting other countries' criticisms or suggestions. You don't have to follow their recommendations. You can just reject them. And China made that happen. You witnessed the rise in rulemaking and agenda-setting powers of China in Human Rights Council, and especially in UPR. And China was a driving force behind this informal policy alliance within the United Nations called Like-Minded Group, LMG. While the key members are, for instance, Russia, India, Pakistan, even though India and Pakistan are not good neighbors, but they are good members in the LMG, representing developing countries and sometimes illiberal states. No love. Okay. Now we call it bending and shouting. I try to have a nice, decent acronym, but then it doesn't work that way, so I have to add "and" between B and S. So, excuse my vulgar language. I tried not to, but here we are. Bear with me. Bending and shouting. Remember the full term, not the acronym. China's rise in organizational, conceptual, and discursive power in human rights bodies is the subject of my studies in this paper. So we do text analytics, that is text mining, and traditional, conventional discourse analysis. The object of our analysis, this textual analysis, is online archives of this government-organized NGO called China Society for Human Rights Studies. Now, it is a registered NGO in Human Rights Council of UN. So it has this official title and privileged access in UN structure. We collected 476 official statements and reports from 2012 to 2017, making it a perfect corpus of Xi Jinping as president of Xi Jinping's human rights policy. And this is the website, so it is open data. It's not state secret. So we scrape the website, get the documents, and we process them into a corpus using R and Python. So we have 476 documents, and we do a little topic modeling. Okay, we use GBR for text segmentation and STM for topic modeling. We do tabulation, visualization, and pattern interpretation. Well, a computer does not do all these. At least the last step is reserved for scholars with domain knowledge. You don't know anything about Chinese human rights, you don't know how to interpret all the text mining and the visualization result. So our mind still matters. Machine doesn't really replace our intelligence. Given the test, this pre-processing steps, we decide to identify 14 topics from the corpus. Okay, and this is the result, topic document matrix. Each document is constituted of 14 topics. And that's the estimation of 14 each topic distribution. Now, if you look at the distribution, you'll realize that topic number 2 is the most salient, the predominant topic of all the human rights documents here, followed by topic number 9, 11, and 12, and 14. All right? What is topic 2 talking about? It talks about China's ambition of redefining international human rights norms. There are 84 documents that devote 90% of its content to this topic, making this one the predominant topic of all the corpus documents. It tells you China's evaluation of UPR procedure. China presented herself as a defender of UPR because China babysat that. China gave birth to UPR system, and that's why China had very high positive remarks on UPR. China became a major stakeholder in UPR. It tells us much about China's norm-shaping power at the global level. And China emphasized developmentalist, materialist dimensions of human rights, economic rights, and the social rights as provided and guaranteed by state, by the government. If your rights, according to the Chinese theory, are provided and guaranteed by the government, then the government is entitled to take that away from you. It is not natural rights, and God doesn't give you those rights. And again, China emphasized very much the voluntarist character of UPR. In each UPR session, Chinese delegates reiterate this founding spirit of UPR, naming that countries can, and it is legitimate for countries to reject criticism and the recommendations made by other countries. And China's human rights discourse is becoming a hegemonic discourse in UPR session. For that matter, China becomes a status quo power in UPR. It's working? Okay. It's delayed for 2 seconds, which is fine. That's how my brain functions. What does topic number 9 say? It talks about redirecting human rights work priority. This is the topic in which China scolds and has scolded UN Human Rights High Commissioner's Office work. It talks about China's evaluations and critiques of High Commissioner's Office's work. China has urged the office to prioritize economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to development, and to demote and downgrade missions covering civil and political rights. China has requested High Commissioner's Office to abide by a sovereignty principle, and China warned High Commissioner's Office to avoid politicization. Now, politicization directly refers to the emphasis and the stress placed on civil and political rights. However, China was still not able to completely control High Commissioner's Office. Those specific mandates, country-specific mandates, are not in full control by China. On the matter of High Commissioner's Office, Beijing plays the role of a revisionist power because she's not happy with the way and the manner by which High Commissioner's Office conducts its work. Topic number 11, the third most dominant topic in this corpus, talks about humanitarian assistance, particularly in Syria. China has urged inclusive political dialogues among warring parties without preconditions. Now, this is the key term, without preconditions. Except for terrorist groups, whoever in participating in that conflict shall have a seat in political dialogue, which went, of course, against Washington and Moscow's policy. China disapproved the idea of international criminal justice. So no matter who they supported, China did not want ICC to get involved in Syrian civil war. Of course, Beijing opposed regime change or direct military intervention, and they don't like this idea of responsibility to protect. This coercive humanitarian intervention is not on their list. So China has highlighted her non-intrusive humanitarian aid and boasting herself as the true defender of international humanitarianism, in contrast to covert operations conducted by the US or overt operations conducted by Moscow. Topic number 10 is the long-term Chinese subject, which is anti-racism. They addressed minority rights, racial discrimination, racism, xenophobia. They showcased China's support for anti-racism and her endorsement of minority rights. And China took the occasion of Human Rights Council debate to discredit Western powers. Mobilization of naming and shaming in reverse. Back in the early 1990s, it was Western powers name and shame China, but 20 years later, the table has changed. Now it's China who carries out this naming and shaming campaign against Western powers through banning and shouting. Okay, I do a little social network analysis, and you realize that all these negative subjects that China highlighted in the Human Rights Council are closely related to each other. But those topics are not the point of my presentation. So far, I've wasted a lot of your time. Topic number 14 is the key point. When you go home tonight, all you need is topic number 14, because this is the topic by which China laid down the new brave world. China has not only resisted and pushed back Western normative pressure, now China has been promoting her own normative principles regarding human rights. And China was confident, and is still even more confident today than last year, to promote and mainstream and universalize her principle of human rights protection. It's a nationalist discourse of human rights. China talked about democratization of international relations, meaning shifting more normative and regulatory power to the developing world, even underdeveloped countries. And they subsume human rights under the pursuit of material development. So intentionally, Beijing has conflated and confused the idea of development with that of human rights. Development and rights, when they were conceptualized during the first few years of the United Nations, they were treated separately, although they cover each other. They are interrelated topics. But in China's interpretation and Chinese discourse, development is rights. Without development, rights are irrelevant and impossible. And such Chinese discourse is gaining ground and legitimacy in SDGs and MDGs, those development platform as a favor espoused by UN. Since late 2016, Xi Jinping's discourse of this 人类命运共同体, constructing a community of shared future for mankind, has been everywhere. All the major diplomats, foreign minister, UN ambassador, US ambassador, everybody has been doing their best to promote Xi Jinping's idea, this universalistic discourse, to mainstream Chinese conception of human rights. The last one. This is an increasingly assertive and ambitious China in international human rights governance. From passivity in 1990s through resistance to proactive leadership, the banning and shouting strategy is working very well, to the extent that last year China was the only country in Human Rights Council defending judicial sovereignty of this great country, the Philippines. In return of what? I'm not sure. And China has become a major stakeholder in UN human rights institutions, a status quo power and a revisionist power at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Titus Chen. Now I open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand and just proceed to the microphones in front. Anyone who would wish to raise a question? Oh, yes.
Good afternoon. I am Marian Ella Ebilio from the Ateneo de Davao University. So my question is that since in the current setting of the international system, the human rights standards is very Western-centric. So in the concept of the Chinese human rights model, how can China materialize this model when in fact the current human rights standard is very Western, and the Western human rights standard has been institutionalized for decades already?
Answer now. So your question is about how China can promote her principle and the norms in basically Western human rights institutions. Is that your question? Okay. Thank you for that. That's a very good and relevant question. But maybe at the beginning, human rights was not that Western. Whoever studies the history, the institutional history of UN human rights institutions know that at the beginning, at day one of UN human rights system, the British, Americans are not that fond of an intrusive human rights system that have enforcement power, implementation power. So eventually, Human Rights Commission had only promotional power, and that's not even actual power. They can only declare, but without implementation power. Toward the 60s and 70s, actually, it was developing countries, African, Latin American, and Middle Eastern powers pushing the elevation, the enhancement of human rights monitoring functions because they were very concerned about Israel's move in Palestine. And that is a policy background. So we had until the end of the Cold War that Western powers found or rediscovered the power of human rights. So that's a very short history when liberal human rights norms was on the rise for the very first time in post-war history. And China had no difficulties identifying allies because, any other countries, members of UN, which are not West, which are not liberal, will be likely to become the victim of human rights monitoring system as imposed by Western powers. So it was never that difficult for China to challenge, if not overthrow, the liberal human rights norms carried out by UN human rights system. And now, given this declining liberal order in the world, the Hegemon, there was the Hegemon for 6 decades, and woke up one morning realizing he or she doesn't want to be Hegemon anymore. And hegemon is not just a power, brute power, it's also about normative and the public goods. And the hegemon in Washington have basically self-abdicated from this hegemonic position. So who is going to carry out the liberal human rights norms? No one would. And that we are talking about a lot of political resources and the capital being invested in human rights protection business. So China had no rival anymore. And Russia is on her side, so it's her high time. You will see more of Chinese speaking and the promotion of her illiberal human rights norms.
Okay. One more question. I'll entertain the guy at the back. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I am Ryan Dave Raila from Cebu Normal University. I would just like to ask the speaker as to what is the core basis of the so-called Chinese version of human rights.
The core notion of Chinese principle of human rights is the state. Now, it is paradoxical and counterintuitive at the first sight, but the argument goes like this: without an independent country, as long as we are still colonized by imperial powers, there is no human rights enjoyed by people. We'll always be subjects, not citizens. We need to be an independent state, and then we talk about human rights. And then it is human rights that is guaranteed and provided and protected by the state government. And now it is the stage where this argument goes very tricky. So as long as to protect your own human rights, according to the Chinese perspective, you have to, first of all, honor your country and protect the image and the power of your own government. And the next stage of argument will be a powerful government protects human rights the best. So augmented state power means protection of human rights. And then they make this organic connection between individual rights and the state power to the extent that you can no longer see the distinction. State power means human rights. Hard to swallow, but living in China for a few years, you adapt to it.
Thank you very much, Professor Titus Chen. A round of applause for his wonderful presentation. Now, it's already the time for the parallel sessions. It's at the Community Center of the First Companions. Please proceed to the Rodriguez Hall and then choose your panels, your parallel sessions. We have actually 2 sets this afternoon. You may now proceed. Please don't forget to come back in the plenary session by 6:45. We will have cocktails and a cultural variety, a cultural show, not cultural variety show. See you later.